Adrian is professor of philosophy at the University of New Mexico and also a faculty member at the Emory Psychoanalytic Institute in Atlanta. Adrian has published extensively several books. His most recent volumes are A New German Idealism, published in 2018 by Columbia, Prolegomena to Any Future Materialism, Volume 2, published by Northwestern in 2019, and most recently, just a couple of weeks ago, Infinite Greed, which was published also by Columbia. The title of Adrian's presentation today is Carnal Knowledge, Mark Solms and the Lacanian Unconscious.
I would like to begin by echoing the thanks that already has been expressed to both Tadej and Lorenzo for having overseen the organization of this event and serving as the ultimate conditions of possibility for this gathering. And also in my case, I would like to extend my gratitude to both Matej and Bostian for having made sure that I got here intact in one piece, ready to participate. What I am going to present is what I managed to write frantically over the course of the past week, the introduction to a text whose main body I will be working on this summer. And in terms of what I plan to engage with apropos Mark Solms's version of neuropsychoanalysis in the main body of this text yet to be written, focuses on three areas. First, Solms's revisions of Freudian drive theory in light, in particular, of more recent neurobiology. Second, Solms's extensive appeals to and reliances upon what he construes Spinoza's dual aspect monism to involve. And third and finally, the details of Solms's recent head-on confrontation with the so-called hard problem of consciousness as canonically formulated by analytic philosopher of mind David Chalmers in his 1996 book, The Conscious Mind. So what I'm going to present now is an introduction to that work yet to be done, but I am very happy to, quite comfortable with discussing some of those details of these topics I just mentioned in Q&A. So let me begin. Mark Solms is the founder and leading figure of what has come to be known as neuro-psychoanalysis. During the 1980s and 1990s, this was a time when psychoanalysis and the neurosciences seemed locked in a winner-takes-all conflict in which analysis appeared to most to be doomed to lose. Solms began laying the foundations for theoretically and clinically interfacing Freud's legacy with biological investigations into the human central nervous system. Solms's decades-long labors in this vein have culminated more recently in a grand theoretical synthesis, bringing together psychoanalysis, particularly Freud's own work and English language traditions of post-Freudianism, neurobiology, especially affective neuroscience a la Jaak Panksepp, and philosophy, both Spinoza's dual aspect monism, as well as recent and contemporary analytic philosophy of mind, as per David Chalmers in particular. This extremely rich and thought-provoking synthesis is most fully represented by his 2021 book, The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. As the immediately preceding already indicates, the psychoanalytic and philosophical sources relied upon by Solms in his engagements with the neurosciences are primarily English-speaking in origin, setting aside the exceptional cases of Spinoza and Freud. This means that, among other things, neither Lacan, himself a lifelong admirer of Spinoza, nor more continentalist approaches to psychoanalysis and its philosophical implications feature in Solms's sophisticated and productive interdisciplinary reflections. Nonetheless, one of my contentions in the context of this critical conversation with Solmsian neuropsychoanalysis is that Solms's recent work, surprisingly and perhaps unintentionally on his part, dovetails with much of what is central to and distinctive of Lacan's rendition of psychoanalysis. Admittedly, many of those with Lacanian leanings will be wary of any talk about a rapprochement between Lacan's doctrines and neuroscientific material. On multiple prior occasions, I have addressed the sorts of reservations responsible for this wariness on the part of the majority of Lacanians toward the natural sciences generally and the brain sciences specifically. In so doing, I have shown that Lacan is anything but a science-phobic anti-naturalist interested in shielding psychoanalysis from contact with adjacent empirical scientific disciplines and discoveries. My treatment of Solms on the present occasion takes for granted my previous efforts to legitimate and defend the idea of perhaps forging something that could be described as a Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis. Much of Lacan's teaching unfolds under the banner of a return to Freud. Solms 2 frames his work as a revisitation and overall, albeit not total, vindication of Freud's corpus. To be more precise, Solms portrays contemporary neurobiology, and especially the subfield of affective neuroscience, as now having developed to a point at which it can partner productively with Freudian psychoanalysis to the mutual benefit of both disciplinary domains. Solms sees his current neuropsychoanalytic labors as carrying forward a research program first outlined in Freud's foundational 1895 manuscript Project for a Scientific Psychology. Most importantly, the past century plus of findings in the brain sciences fully justifies Freud's foundational analytic gesture of decoupling the mental from the conscious. Apropos the positioning of psychoanalysis vis-a-vis the sciences, Lacan, in his 1965 summary of his 1964 11th seminar on the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, suggests the need to move from the more familiar standard question, is psychoanalysis a science, to asking instead, what would be a science that includes psychoanalysis? Likewise, Solmsian neuropsychoanalysis, rather than seeking in a one-way fashion to judge analysis by the standards of scientificity associated with the neurosciences, argues on combined psychoanalytic and philosophical grounds for the urgent need, quote, to return subjectivity to neuroscience, end quote. In this vein, Solms, echoing Eric Kandel, adds, quote, for all its faults, psychoanalysis currently provides the best conceptual starting point for tackling subjectivity scientifically, end quote. Solms also expresses optimism about what he describes as a recent growing revival of receptivity to psychoanalytic ideas amongst neuroscientists and their fellow travelers. For Solmsian neuropsychoanalysis, the theory and practice of analysis indeed ought to be receptive to modifications in light of ongoing advances in the neurosciences. But reciprocally, these same sciences, up to and including the basic images and notions of nature on which they rest, must be transformed in order non-reductively to explain, instead of reductively explain away, the speaking subjects at the center of psychoanalytic experience. Lacan and Solms, despite their many differences, share a desire to hold on to and bring together both scientificity and subjectivity, so as to forge their own versions of what fairly could be called a science of subjectivity, rather than either an objective qua-subjectless science or an anti-scientific theory of subjects purported to be wholly and completely non-natural. By Solms's lights, neuropsychoanalysis indeed would be such a science of subjectivity, with its neuroscientific side addressing the objective brain and its psychoanalytic side addressing the subjective mind. Underlying this approach to a science of subjectivity is Solms's reliance on Spinozistic dual-aspect monism, with this monism's dual aspects being Spinoza's 2 attributes of thinking, associated by Solms with the subjective mind, and extension associated by Solms with the objective brain, as well as with all the rest of the physical world. Perhaps the most significant and striking point of convergence between Lacan and Solms concerns the distinction in Freud's thinking between the unconscious and the id. Crude and uninformed handlings of Freudian terminology often use unconscious and id as though they were synonymous, and Solms somewhat unfairly occasionally accuses Freud himself of erroneously conflating the unconscious with the id. But even when these two terms are rightly recognized as somehow or other distinct in Freud's writings, the prevailing assumption is that the id, as the seat of the drives, is inherently unconscious, with the ego, as per the second topography, correspondingly assumed to be inherently conscious. In ways that Lacan himself no doubt would appreciate, Solms, drawing especially on recent developments in affective neuroscience, directly challenges the standard view according to which the id is unconscious and the ego is conscious. In fact, Solms completely inverts the standard view, maintaining both that the id is largely conscious, as well as that significant portions of the ego are unconscious. He relatedly advances the striking thesis according to which, quote, consciousness is generated in the id, end quote. Solms's arguments bound up with this inversion involve establishing two sets of equivalences. On the one hand, he equates the psychoanalytic id subjectively with the affective and objectively with the evolutionarily archaic brainstem common to all mammals. On the other hand, he equates the psychoanalytic ego subjectively with the cognitive and objectively with the evolutionarily recent neocortex unique to the species Homo sapiens. The id as feeling brainstem and the ego as thinking neocortex are, in a sense, different in kind from each other. But they simultaneously are bound together in an awkward, conflict-prone cohabitation within both brain and mind, as the dual aspects, objective and subjective respectively, of the psychical apparatus and or as the central nervous system. With these parallel chains of equivalence established thusly, Solms brings into consideration a psychoanalytic thesis according to which all affects are conscious. Insofar as feelings are, by definition, felt, there can be no such things as unconscious affects qua unfelt feelings. In this vein, Solms asserts, quote, it is not the emotions that are unconscious so much as the cognitive things they are about, end quote. Before proceeding further, I should note that Solms's claims in this vein are in line not only with a certain Freud, who sometimes denies the very coherency of any notion of unconscious affect, but also with a Lacan who repeatedly appeals to this same Freudian denial. Yet, as I argue at length in my half of a 2013 book I co-authored with Kathleen Malabou, Self and Emotional Life, Philosophy, Psychoanalysis, and Neuroscience, Freud's and Lacan's clinical and metapsychological reflections on affects are much more complicated and ambiguous than amounting to an unqualified rejection of the very notion of unconscious dimensions of affective life. Without rehearsing my arguments from Self and Emotional Life, I will note here in passing that I suspect Solms's sweeping dismissals of the entire category of unconscious affect are due to his overriding focus on affects at the level of Panksepp's taxonomy of primal emotions exhibited across all mammalian species. In line with this focus on the affective neuroscience of the raw feelings of mammals, rather than the psychoanalysis of the complex sentiments of humans specifically, Solms emphasizes the ineliminable natural background of animalistic instincts, reflexes, and the like in human affective existence. Solms likewise stresses that, quote, civilization played no part in the design of our brains, end quote. However, by Solms's own occasional admissions, quote unquote, civilization, as the ensemble of human contextual mediators involving society, culture, language, history, tools, technology, and so on, civilization indeed does end up playing parts in molding our brains, albeit not via evolutionary pressures, but rather via various forms of learning as conceptualized by Solms. He sometimes invokes quote-unquote learnt constructs, consisting of, quote, hybrids of emotion and cognition, end quote. Apropos such hybrid learnt constructs, this hybridity amounts to a blending of nature associated by Solms with affect and nurture associated by Solms with cognition. Solms and co-author George Ellis assert, quote, not all affects are innate. There are also learnt affects, end quote. He also grants that higher-level brain evolution permits the advent of intrapsychical defense mechanisms that get deployed against various, usually negative affects, emotions, and feelings. Related to this, and just a few pages later in the same text after this concession about defenses, Solms remarks, quote, the so-called drive energies that activate cognition are intrinsically conscious, although the transformations they are subject to frequently render them inaccessible to reflexive awareness, end quote. Furthermore, Solms emphasizes that learning in his sense as bringing about partially denaturalizing rewirings in the central nervous system, learning is made possible by the interlinked factors of neuroplasticity and epigenetics. Indeed, throughout his book with Ellis, 2018's Beyond Evolutionary Psychology, How and Why Neuropsychological Modules Arise, Solms tirelessly stresses that neuroplasticity and epigenetics reveal the human brain to be anything but a causally closed natural machine, impervious to being influenced and modified by more than natural, especially in Solms's terms, civilizational mediators. Instead, the human brain, from birth onwards, is continually shaped and reshaped by external factors bound up with historically variable forms of human sociality. As Ellis and Solms rightly observe in connection with recent biological discoveries having to do with neuroplasticity, epigenetics, and their causal efficacy at the level of natural matter itself, quote, an adequate investigation of the nature-nurture issue must take such biological effects into account, end quote. Likewise, with co-author Oliver Turnbull, Solms elsewhere states, quote, nature and nurture are in a dynamic interplay from the earliest moments of development, end quote. Relatedly, Solms in The Hidden Spring observes that, quote, the brain is structurally hierarchical. It is layered somewhat like an archaeological site with the older levels covered over by the newer ones, end quote. An observation tacitly echoing certain of Freud's descriptions of the psychical apparatus. A little later in this 2021 book, he adds, quote, a hierarchy of plasticity exists in terms of which the core predictions cannot change, but the peripheral ones can and do, end quote. Solms considers the natural foundations of the conscious feeling id to be a non-plastic core overlaid by a plastic periphery consisting of the non-natural accumulated strata constitutive of the unconscious thinking ego, or as Lacan might prefer to describe the latter, the speaking subject of the signifying unconscious structured like a language. One of the features of Solms's avowedly anti-reductive neuro-psychoanalytic handling of the soma-psyche relationship is highly relevant in the context of this brief reevaluation of the topic of unconscious affect. Despite pursuing a neurobiological approach to psychoanalysis, Solms is careful to avoid the localizationism too often associated with neuroscientific research programs. Ellis and Solms, at one point in their co-authored book, warned that excesses of localizationist thinking in the neurosciences risk recapitulating the intellectual bankruptcies of 19th century phrenology and faculty psychologies. Relatedly, Solms and co-author Karen Kaplan-Solms, in a book centered on clinical neuropsychoanalysis, appealed directly to Freud himself in opposing localizationist approaches in neurobiology. But why exactly is localizationism so problematic for Solms? Solms maintains that human mental functions and phenomena are, in all their multifaceted complexity, highly distributed across the inner landscape of neuroanatomy. This is especially the case with the sorts of multifaceted psychical structures and dynamics of central concern to specifically psychoanalytic considerations at the levels of both metapsychological theory and clinical practice. Indeed, Solms goes so far as to contend that, quote, a mental function can never be located within an anatomical structure, end quote. He promptly specifies, quote, mental functions can never be found inside neuroanatomical structures. They exist, as it were, between them, end quote. Then adding that, quote, mental life in its essence is in its essence a dynamic process which carries within itself the whole of its developmental history. Processes of this type can never be concretely located in the anatomical structures of the brain, end quote. This addition suggests that mind is not only synchronically highly distributed in space across and between the components and subcomponents of neuroanatomy, but also diachronically highly distributed in time across its history, with this history being not only ontogenetic, as Solms suggests, but also social, phylogenetic, and even evolutionary. Hence, mindedness, both conscious and unconscious, is more a matter of relations between relata than the relata themselves. In terms of Solms's objections to localizationism, these relata are the neuroanatomical locales as parts forming the whole of the brain and or as the mind, a whole greater than the mere side-by-side mechanical sum of its parts. This brings Solms again into implicit proximity to Lacanian psychoanalytic thinking. The anti-reductive gesture by Solms in his opposition to programs of neuroanatomical localization This gesture of privileging relations over relata subtly resonates with such continental philosophical references, ones profoundly shaping Lacan's sensibilities, as the Hegel who prioritizes mediations over the mediated, and the Saussure who prioritizes the differential relationships between signifiers over the signifiers themselves. In addition, Kant's groundbreaking manners of contrasting the organic and the mechanical in his 1790 critique of the power of judgment palpably lurk in the intellectual historical background, with Solms in The Hidden Spring explicitly referencing this Kant. So, what about the controversial topic of unconscious affect? What does the immediately preceding entail for this topic? In light of my comments regarding the anti-reductive features of Solms's brand of neuro-psychoanalysis, two consequences clearly follow from these just glossed features. First, thanks to learning broadly speaking is made possible by epigenetics and neuroplasticity, many of the regions and subregions of the human brain end up quite denaturalized thanks to the formative sculpting influences of environmental, especially civilizational factors and variables. Second, insofar as for Solms both the brain and the mind are what they are as systems, primarily on the basis of the interconnections as relations between their constituent components and subcomponents as relata, as soon as just some of the brain's parts are subjected to efficacious denaturalizing influences, the mind as a whole is effectively denaturalized too. In short, the wholes greater than the sums of their parts of brain and mind arise out of endogenous networks of relations in which many of the relata incarnate more than natural exogenous mediations and their embodied impacts on the human organism. Hence, Solms, with this aspect of his neuropsychoanalytic picture in view, ought to be by his own lights a little more self-critical of his neurobiology-inspired tendencies periodically to lapse into overemphasizing the naturalistic basis of psychical life, and this at the expense of acknowledging just how far-reaching are the denaturalizing modulations of this life by social, historical, linguistic, institutional, etc. dimensions. Particularly under the inspiration he draws from Panksepp's version of affective neuroscience, he sometimes comes across as though, on his assessment, the more than natural cognitive ego is quote-unquote peripheral, qua merely marginal, secondary, and the like, with respect to the natural affective id, as presumably hegemonic within the mindedness of the human mammal. Yet, and to borrow phrasing from Hegel, in the inverted worlds of humanity's self-fabricated artificial realities, the natural may very well be the exception vis-a-vis the rule of the denaturalized in human psychical life. This might be so not only because the quantifiable majority of individuated brain locales and distinct mental operations are probably at least somewhat shaped by non-natural influences forming and deforming the plastic matter of the epigenetically malleable central nervous system. This is so also because even if a quantifiable majority of these locales and operations were to be purely quote-unquote natural, in the sense of being untouched and unmodified by civilizational mediators, Solms's anti-reductive concession that a far from insignificant number of such locales and operations are denaturalized by sociosymbolic mediation has more radical anti-naturalistic implications than Solms might be willing to entertain. How so? Solms's anti-localizationist emphasis on the neuropsychoanalytic primacy of relations over relata, given the distribution of mental processes across multiple neuroanatomical regions and subregions, suggests that the denaturalization of even a quantifiable minority of parts of the brain is enough to denaturalize the brain as a whole. Why? If, as Solms himself maintains, the brain in its entirety is the system of relations between its components, rather than a simple numerical aggregate of these components, then introducing even a few non-natural components into this system consequently and necessarily changes the status and organization of this system in its entirety. The whole formed by the web of connections between the brain's regions and subregions would be altered with the introduction of denaturalized or more than natural parts into this whole. For example, such parts as non-innate cortical modules acquired through ex utero developmental and learning processes. Similarly, if and when, for instance, certain naturally innate Pankseppian emotional systems get activated in human brains and show up in the experiential guises of mammalian feelings, in what is taken to be their brute animalistic rawness. Such raw feels, such uncooked qualia, always resurface within the enveloping matrices of intrasubjective and intersubjective mediating relations involving all sorts of non-natural, uniquely human structures and dynamics. Additionally, clinical psychoanalysts more often have to deal with affective nuances and subtleties involving ambivalences, obscurities, and uncertainties for their analysans than with readily identifiable eruptions of unmistakably pure and clear expressions of rudimentary mammalian feeling states. This makes it such that more than natural meanings, significances, and so on automatically, inevitably, and immediately come to color manifestations of even the most basic mammalian affects and emotions within both the singularity of subjects and the collectivity of societies. One could argue that Lacan's metapsychological conception of need in relation to both demand and desire makes this exact point, with the organism's natural needs being promptly and inevitably inflected by the signifying structures and dynamics of socio-symbolic mediators. In the topsy-turvy virtual realities characteristic of the species Homo sapiens, the distinction between the natural and the non-natural comes to be a distinction internal to the non-natural itself. All of this follows from the ontological/mereological commitment Solms, as already seen, commits himself to in his privileging of distribution over localization within a neuro-psychoanalytic recasting of the brain-mind relationship. So what about Solms's blanket dismissal of the very category of unconscious affect? What relevance does this brief detour of mine, apropos the naturalistic dimension of Solmsian neuropsychoanalysis, have for this perennially contentious issue in the psychoanalytic tradition going back to Freud himself? At this juncture, I take myself to have established at a minimum that Solms grants civilizational influences extremely broad and deep mediating roles in the human central nervous system, resulting in denaturalizations with ramifications for the global character and operations of mental and psychical life as a whole. To cut a very long story very short, again, I tell this story at length in my half of Self and Emotional Life, Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis alike indicate in multiple ways why and how various affective phenomena subjected to the mediations of socio-symbolic matrices and processes end up distorted and mistranslated by conscious self-misunderstanding under the pressure of intrapsychical defense mechanisms. Hence, as I argue in that 2013 book, there at least are unconscious affects as, so to speak, misfelt feelings rather than unfelt feelings, namely distorted and mistranslated affective phenomena qualitatively altered under the combined influences of socio-symbolic mediators and psychical defense mechanisms. To take a simple and typical analytic example, repressed sexual excitement can be misfelt as anxiety rather than lust due to repression. Admittedly, Solms periodically acknowledges in a number of manners some far from negligible differences between the accounts of affective life in neuroscience versus in psychoanalysis. But his version of neuropsychoanalysis regularly seems to favor excessively the Panksepp-type affective neuroscience of mammals in general over psychoanalysis's clinically informed metapsychology of affects concerned specifically with humans and all their quirkiness, both as a species and as singular subjects. The combination of Solms's Pankseppianism with his unqualified dismissal of all talk of anything along the lines of unconscious affect leads to his neuropsychoanalytic account of affective life being in danger of neglecting and even excluding psychoanalysis's invaluable contributions to our understanding of distinctively human forms of emotions, feelings, and related qualia. So, with me having quickly addressed Solms on unconscious affect, what about the issue that prompted this digression of mine, namely, Solms's bold inversion, according to which the ego is unconscious and the id conscious? As I already noted, Solms ties analysis's id to neuroanatomy's brainstem with its affects, and analysis's ego to neuroanatomy's neocortex with its cognitions. Apropos the latter, he emphasizes, quote, cortical functions are not inherently conscious, end quote. He likewise stresses that, quote, cortical processes are fundamentally unconscious things. They are simply algorithms if left to their own devices, end quote. Correspondingly, Solms maintains that, quote, the cortex becomes conscious only to the extent that it is aroused by the brainstem, end quote. He then concludes, quote, since cortical consciousness is contingent upon brainstem consciousness, affect is revealed to be the foundational form of consciousness. The sentient subject is literally constituted by affect, end quote. In other words, quote, feelings are the wellspring of sentient being, end quote. There are only a few more of these very brief quotations left, just bear with me. Correlatively but conversely, Solms insists that, quote, there is no evidence that living neocortex alone, without subcortical supports, can have any subjective experiences at all, end quote. And that, quote, neocortex without a brainstem can never be conscious, end quote. Instead, quote, the neocortex, the supposed repository of consciousness, is intrinsically unconscious, end quote. The most obvious implicit theoretical locus of convergence between Solms and Lacan has to do with their shared dissociation of the unconscious from the id. For Lacan, the Freudian unconscious, properly conceived, is anything but the id, as imagined along the lines of a romantic-style depth psychology, namely a hidden inner cauldron of archaic animalistic impulses and urges, or a dark internal ocean of roiling instincts and primitive passions. Moreover, as Solms would highlight, such affective and libidinal forces always are felt by minded beings and hence are hues of the light of consciousness rather than of the unconscious. The Lacanian unconscious is structured like a language, is formed in, as, and by networks of what Freud labels ideational representations, Vorstellungen, with Lacan insisting that such Vorstellungen amount to and function as signifiers in Lacan's heterodox Saussurean sense. To slightly oversimplify, Solms's unconscious ego of the cognitive neocortex roughly resembles the distinctively Lacanian unconscious structured like a language. However, Lacan, in line with his careful distinguishing between ego and subject, would prefer to speak, as he consistently does, of the subject of the unconscious in place of Solms's talk of the unconscious ego. Incidentally, but along these same lines, a Lacanian might legitimately complain that the adjective unconscious as used by Solms when referring to the neocortical ego is not the psychoanalytic unconscious, but refers rather to being non-conscious in general. Psychoanalytically speaking, this non-consciousness should be internally differentiated, in line with Freud's insights, into preconscious and unconscious dimensions. Only some of the neocortical ego's non-consciousness is unconscious in the strict analytic sense. That said, not only are there unconscious dimensions of the Lacanian ego, Solms, once again implicitly brushing up against some of Lacan's own claims, sometimes depicts the analytic ego as a certain sort of object, rather than itself a subject. He proposes that, quote, the external body corresponds to the ego, the internal body is the id, end quote. Solms subsequently specifies in the same article that, quote, the external body is not the owner or locus of consciousness. It is not really the subjective self, it is an objective representation of the self, end quote. Thus, as regards the philosophical distinction between subjectivity and objectivity, quote, the external body is not a subject but an object, end quote. An aspect of Solms's portrayal of the Freudian ego overlaps with something fundamental to the entirety of Lacan's account of the analytic ego. The ego is primordially a libidinally cathected bundle of sensory perceptual elements and mnemic traces bound up with one's body and its images. The ego is more an object than a subject, a static representation instead of a kinetic agent. The real difference between Lacan's and Solms's accounts of the ego is that the latter, unlike the former, does not demote the entirety of the ego to the status of mere objectivity, albeit an objectivity misrecognized as a site of subjective agency, a la Lacan's account of méconnaissance in his formulations of the mirror stage. Instead, Solms preserves a dimension of agential subjectivity as an alleged face of the ego over and above its more objective face. It admittedly is difficult for a Lacanian not to hear this preservation, as Solms tacitly remaining faithful to Anglo-American ego psychology's debatable notion, one regularly rubbished by Lacan, of quote-unquote a conflict-free sphere of the ego, as a sector of this intrapsychical entity purported to be capable of such functions of the traditional pre-Freudian philosophical subject as self-conscious reflective deliberation and autonomous rational decision-making. Nevertheless, for Lacan and Solms alike, in terms of their theorizations of the analytic unconscious and in their shared fidelity to Freud, the intrapsychical defense mechanisms constitutive of the specifically psychoanalytic unconscious are brought to bear primarily at the level of cognition rather than affect. Moreover, the acquired, not innate cognitions of Solms's plastic neocortex can, and I would say should, be further developed theoretically through being reinterpreted along the lines of the Lacanian conceptions of signifiers and the register of the symbolic. As I now will demonstrate, there are numerous openings in Solms's own work inviting a rapprochement with Lacanian psychoanalysis in this very vein. My focus in what immediately follows will be on various claims and arguments to be found in the 2018 book Solms co-authors with Ellis, namely Beyond Evolutionary Psychology, their thoroughgoing critique of the very notion or basic program of all versions of evolutionary psychology, a critique with which Lacan undoubtedly would largely agree. At the very beginning of Beyond Evolutionary Psychology, Solms and Ellis start by underscoring just how much of the human central nervous system is shaped in its plasticity by ex utero environmentally shaped development, with peculiarly human social settings being the most important and influential of these environments. Solms and Ellis contend that, in the case of the human brain, epigenetics dominates over evolution. This dominance is especially pronounced in the unique to humans neocortex. The co-authors of Beyond Evolutionary Psychology reinforce these initial assertions, apropos the epigenetics of the plastic brain, by pointing to the astronomical number of synaptic connections within the human central nervous system. As regards this fact, it is mathematically impossible for the comparatively limited amount of quantifiable information contained in DNA to be credited with coding these synaptic connections in advance. The vast majority of systems, or quote-unquote modules, formed by constellations of wired-together synapses, especially in the cognitive neocortex, must be acquired in relation to a partially denaturalized and denaturalizing environment, rather than being innate in terms of being naturally programmed by evolution and genetics. This is a matter of soft wiring, or quote-unquote soft-wired connections, as Solms and Ellis put it, rather than hard wiring. With there being a quantitatively gargantuan excess of synaptic connections over the comparatively very limited amount of genetic information encoded in DNA, more than genetic exogenous forces and factors are left to prune and strengthen the sizable bulk of the brain's synaptic connections. Furthermore, Solms and Ellis are committed to a virulently anti-reductive strong emergentism, allowing for so-called downward causation. On the basis of this commitment, they write of, quote, top-down control of gene regulatory circuits through the activity of the mind, end quote, describing how, quote, the way genes are read in the brain is influenced by our mental states and by social information, end quote. That is to say, the, quote-unquote, civilized mind, whose genesis and structure rely broadly and deeply on sociosymbolic mediations, can and does downwardly act upon its lower, including innately natural, layers and strata. The central nervous system's receptivity enabling all of this just mentioned mediation amounts to neuroplasticity as a natural material possibility condition for distinctively human forms of mindedness and like-mindedness. As I indicated a short while ago, both Lacan's subject of the unconscious and Solms's unconscious ego, despite their differences, are bound up with specifically cognitive rather than affective or motivational brain functions rooted in the neocortex. And from Solms's science-informed perspective, the maximally plastic neocortex is entirely governed by acquired soft-wired connections rather than innate hard-wired connections. When it comes to the extremely plastic neocortex especially, nurture definitely dominates over nature. For Solms, although there are innate emotions, as per his investment in cross-species affective neuroscience, there are no innate ideas qua naturally pre-programmed cognitive contents. As he and Ellis put it at one point, quote, "There are no innate representations," end quote, including no hardwired Freudian Vorstellungen and or Lacanian signifiers. In the same context, Solms and Ellis then promptly proceed to emphasize that, quote, "Cortical functions are not genetically determined," end quote. They foreground the roles of both epigenetics and neuroplasticity, as well as the learning these two factors make possible in configuring the precise contours of the neocortex and its myriad intricate networks of soft-wired synapses. Solms and Ellis also acknowledge the especially potent roles of intersubjective and transsubjective relationships in carving the contours of the neocortex. Elsewhere and beyond evolutionary psychology, Solms and Ellis proffer the thesis that Panksepp's quote-unquote blue ribbon mammalian emotional systems, as natural apparatuses hardwired into the feeling brainstem, as the conscious id, that these function a bit like Descartes' pineal gland. Quote, "Affective systems are the innate modules that shape both cognitive development and behavior and are the linchpin between evolution and psychological development," end quote. Just as for Descartes, the pineal gland is a special locus, a crossroads or intersection within the brain, wherein the otherwise partitioned ontological regions of res cogitans and res extensa interact and mutually influence each other, so too with the set of primary emotion systems in the brainstem for Solms and his collaborators. The brainstem, with its fundamental mammalian affects, brokers relationships between the differentiated domains of nature, as evolution and genetics, and nurture, as denaturalizing sociosymbolic mediations able to shape the brain thanks to epigenetics and neuroplasticity. Given the centrality of the neocortex for language, in conjunction with this brain region's reliance on acquired external inputs and variables, particularly social ones, for its very constitution in terms of its synaptic connections and networks, Solms and Ellis are led to reject completely anything along the lines of Steven Pinker's infamous hypothesized language instinct. Here, Pinker, with the figure of Noam Chomsky looming behind him, would exemplify the sort of evolutionary psychology Solms and Ellis seek to move beyond, as per the title of their co-authored book. Solms and Ellis flatly deny this Pinkerian hypothesis. Quote, "There is no language instinct," end quote. For them, language, quote, "is learnt. It is not an instinct," end quote. One of the implications of the synonymy in Lacan's own technical vocabulary between symbolic order and big other is this synonymy's indication that language as symbolic comes from an external elsewhere, hence its otherness. Lacan would be entirely sympathetic to the Solmsian neuro-psychoanalytic opposition to Pinker's evolutionary naturalization of language. Indeed, the later Lacan was disappointed and discouraged after personally meeting Chomsky during a 1975 visit to the United States, expressing dismay at the American linguist's reduction of language to a sort of bodily organ, in terms of a naturally innate, quote-unquote, deep grammar encoded in the foundations of all human brains. A couple of times, Solms and Ellis appeal to the work of Terence Deacon. Specifically, they endorse Deacon's accounts of languages as external systems transcending individual human brains and bodies, and containing objective, quote-unquote, semiological constraints of their own, with these constraints arguably being akin to the Lacanian big other's laws of signifiers imposing themselves on speaking subjects subjected to these laws. At this juncture, it is worthwhile to return to the topic of the psychoanalytic unconscious at the intersection of Lacanian and Solmsian metapsychologies. And I return now to this topic in light particularly of Solms's various highlightings of the cognitive neocortex in its epigenetics and plasticity-enabled reliance on external, especially sociolinguistic matrices of mediation for the constellating of its webs of synaptic connections. As seen, Solms contends that the analytic id, as neurologically correlating with an affective brainstem that is genetically programmed and quite non-plastic, The id is not to be associated with the analytic unconscious. Instead, Solms, with his distinctive conception of the conscious id in view, bluntly insists that, quote, consciousness is endogenously generated, all of it, end quote. Insofar as the affective id gives rise to consciousness, and insofar as this id is the subjective side of the objective brainstem, as inflexibly hardwired by evolution and genetics, so as to be endogenously impervious at its evolutionarily ancient core to exogenous influences, given all of this, consciousness itself is endogenous, an internal in-here of first-person consciousness with its sense of itself as an inner mind separate and distinct from an outer world. Given this, what about the unconscious in Solmsian neuropsychoanalysis? Solms's conception of the unconscious ego obviously accompanies for him that of the conscious id. The Solmsian unconscious ego is, in many ways, the opposite of the conscious id, with these two forming a kind of neuropsychoanalytic odd couple. Therefore, it follows that the Solmsian unconscious, like its Lacanian counterpart, is exogenous, namely out there, inextricably intertwined with the extracorporeal inter- and transsubjective dimensions of speech, language, sociality, symbolization, and the like. Solms's theories concerning the conscious id and the unconscious ego bring him into perhaps surprising proximity with some of Lacan's views in terms of positing a fundamental externality involved with the psychoanalytic unconscious, an unconscious that can and does hide in plain sight, as suggested by, for instance, Lacan's celebrated interpretation of Poe's The Purloined Letter. Thanks to Solms's work, it now can be seen that the grounds for a rapprochement between Lacanian psychoanalysis and the neurosciences perhaps has been hiding in plain sight for at least the past 3 decades. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I'm struggling with the mic. Okay.
Don't worry, this kills time.
Well, how long Q&A is warming up? Yes.
Thank you, Adrian, for that wonderful paper. I just had a quick question about the book Biology of Freedom and Anselmo and Magistrati and
Yes.
sort of what their neuropsychoanalytic modeling would do. I mean, modeling for want of a better word. I mean, Lacan would hate that word. Support may be a better word. Neuropsychoanalytic support. In the sense that they do not collapse the synaptic and the psychic traces, but they talk about a second-order tracing, right? Where the perception produces signifiers, and then those signifiers associate with each other to produce a second-order tracing of signifiers, and then a new signified, which may not have any direct relation with the perception, right?
Yes.
So I'm just kind of wondering what Solms's framework would perhaps do that has not been done in a sense by Anselmo and Magistrati. Just to put that question more directly, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I, in the Self and Emotional Life book, as well as in a few other places, I have extended treatments of Anselmo and Magistrati, but given that I did that almost a decade ago, in fact, began doing that well over a decade ago, my memory is slightly faded. My main complaint that I recall, apropos Anselmo and Magistrati's work, was more philosophical than neuropsychoanalytic, and it's that the two of them seem to believe that as soon as you demonstrate that a kind of causally closed naturalism or physicalism is not tenable at the level of especially the human organism with the particularities of its central nervous system, that showing that is tantamount to having provided a full-fledged theory of subjective autonomy or freedom, right? In the very title of the book, even though in French the original title is To Each His Own Brain, the English translators rendered it as Biology of Freedom, but but that was not entirely inappropriate given the content. And with the two of them, it was really a matter of, and this I see versions of this sometimes in talk about things like contingency, et cetera, in certain contemporary philosophical discussions, that there's a sense that if you show that we are not determined by various and sundry natural forces and factors, that simply showing our indetermination vis-a-vis those determinants, we have demonstrated our freedom. Well, indetermination is a far cry from self-determination, and only the latter, I think, would really qualify as a philosophically satisfying account of freedom, at least in terms of more traditional libertarian free will models of individual subjectivity and its agency. Now, I do, in terms of Solms vis-a-vis Answer-Me and Magistrati, I don't know of anywhere where he directly engages with them. He does sometimes have brief exchanges with certain Lacanians. For instance, Ariane Bazin, who is doing Lacanian neuro-psychoanalytic work in Belgium, and then more recently with actually a young scholar who's doing excellent work, who's now at Duquesne, but who started off as an undergraduate at Brown working with Joan. And a number of years ago, Joan emailed me and said, well, I have this undergraduate student who's very interested in Lacan and neuroscience. Would it be okay if he sent you an email? I said, yeah, sure. Sort of the rest is history. John Dell'Aglio is his name, and he has a book on Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis coming out in the Palgrave Lacan series later this year that's really excellent. And he and Solms actually had an exchange in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. But I would say that there's, generally speaking, more or less a compatibility between at least the foundational insights and motivations that you find in Answer-Me and Magistrati, where likewise, both of them latch on to, the epigenetic and neuroplastic features of the human central nervous system, and then leverage that to be able to argue that here we have from within biology acknowledging that not everything can be explained by biology precisely because we have a biological account of how more than biological influences bed down in the very, matter of the organism itself, in a way where the explanatory buck can't just, begin and end entirely within the endogenous domain of the organic body. And so in that level, there's a broad similarity. And I think that, moreover, at least Solms's recent work, and what I'm focusing on here is really material that he's published from 2015 onward. I think that he has become, if anything, increasingly receptive to, even though he doesn't use the vocabulary, the sorts of models of the relationship between the perceptual and indeed, for instance, in the book with Ellis, 2018's Beyond Evolutionary Psychology, he indeed talks about, distinctions between, the initial, sensory perceptual inputs, and then how that gets, worked up into, elaborated into various abstractions, including what we would consider to be the conceptual over and above the perceptual. And I suspect at those moments that if one were to go back and look at a text like Answer-Me and Magistrati's Biology of Freedom, that one could, massage the two different languages such as to, perhaps at least allow for cross-fertilization, if not total agreement. Thank you.
Questions?
Got the crickets chirping. Soon the hook will be coming to yank me off stage.
We have time for a couple of questions.
I have just one. Do you hear me? I have just one very small remark, and it's not mine. I would consider it too easy if it were mine, but it is actually Friedrich Nietzsche's. And it's about the concept of unconscious affects. So, Nietzsche did speak about unconscious affects, but he considered them, or he represented them as too fast for the consciousness to register. And I find kind of an interesting idea, because in this sense they are a part of consciousness, but in a way they elude it. So I think it's potentially just as an observation.
And it also resonates with, you might recall that, for instance, in Lacan in his, 1974 appearance on French state television, at one point complained that the best Freud did in terms of coming up with a name for his discovery was to just, call it the unconscious and to rely on that negation, and that, perhaps we need a better word. And I think for a number of reasons, including related to some of what you brought up. I mean, here also, of course, is hard not to think of behind this Nietzsche, the Leibniz of petite perception and that whole tradition. I was relying in terms of my relatively brief critical remarks vis-a-vis Solms, on work I had done in this earlier book, the 2013 Self and Emotional Life volume. There, one of the things that I discovered is, of course, especially if you come at Freud from a Lacanian angle, you are usually conditioned based on Lacan's repeated appeals specifically to, these passages in Freud's 1915 metapsychological paper on the unconscious, where it does indeed seem as though Freud categorically denies as just conceptually incoherent, as a contradiction in terms, the idea of unconscious affect. That would be unfelt feeling, and feelings by definition are felt, therefore this simply is null and void as a possible concept. But both before and after that, as early as, the first place I recall coming across this in Freud dates from 1907. Freud, at least when it comes to the affect of guilt, is repeatedly willing to entertain the possibility of unconscious guilt and to speak of guilt as in some way an affect, right? And so already, and that's just one example, but the picture in Freud's own corpus is far from as clear-cut as, that one moment in 1915's The Unconscious would make it seem. And then with Lacan, even though there too, Lacan, of course, appears to be much more consistent in his denial of, the very idea of unconscious affect, that even with Lacan himself, the waters get a bit muddied. And that, especially in his later work, and especially in connection with some of his reworkings of his notion of language in relation to jouissance, and when he starts talking about la langue, in the 1970s, in connection with that, and in a way that someone like Colette Soler has nicely brought out in her book on affects from a Lacanian standpoint. The picture too in Lacan is likewise a much more unstable and ambiguous than the official picture of, all right, Freud and then Lacan following him both just rule this out as conceptually incoherent. But Solms is much more like that. He really, whenever the topic comes up explicitly, he's just absolutely categorical in his denial and dismissal of the coherency of the notion. Yet, as I try to point out, so much of what he says in other respects seem to not allow for concluding anything other than, well, you have to have some, however you conceive of it, notion of not explicitly conscious dimensions of affective life, that your own neuro-psychoanalytic framework seems to require, despite your explicit denials of this as a viable concept. So it's an interesting problem. And for me, it was one of the things after I finished my psychoanalytic training, I wrote that early work on unconscious affect in part because it was an unresolved question for me, both in terms of discussions and debates in the seminars for training candidates, as well as in terms of my own didactic analysis too. And so it also has you might say a certain kind of autobiographical or personal pull for me in terms of topic of fascination. But that I didn't know about that particular aspect of Nietzsche in terms of just the fleeting rapidity. But that's very helpful. So thank you, Alish.
Do you have time for one final quick question, if there's any?
Thank you for the presentation. I was reminded all the way through your presentation of a simple sentence from Hegel, which says, feeling is the first immediate form of the concept. And in a sense, the concept is clearer, but in the future, while the feeling and consciousness would be muddled and right now. I don't know.
No,
What did you say about that?
This is actually helpful, and of course, with Hegel too, this indicates as well. So often I think the pictures of Hegel, sort of portray him as, a kind of hyper-rationalistic sort of thinker who, would just sort of denigrate or dismiss things like feelings, and would think of it as all right. In the same way, he is often very scornful of what he calls picture thinking, as an impure, inadequate. A framing of things that has to be purified and raised to the dignity of its notion by pure philosophical cognition, etc. That Hegel's Realphilosophy contains things that cut dramatically against that picture of him, and in addition, and it was funny. I was talking about this with Emily over lunch. I think that there is this often underappreciated sense in terms of the history of philosophy concerned with German idealism. That amongst scholars of German idealism, even, and especially coming at it informed by subsequent post-Hegelian continental philosophical sensibilities, there is a tendency to forget just how crucial a role British empiricism played in the genesis and unfolding of German idealism. Of course, most famously, everyone pays lip service, to Kant's remark at the start of 1785's Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics that it was David Hume who awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. But usually the acknowledgement goes only that far, and then the idea of the role of British empiricism in the tradition of German idealism seems to get forgotten. But of course, after Kant publishes the first critique, he's hit with a volley of neo-Humean kind of skeptical challenges, and then that neo-Humeanism prompts the early Fichte and Schelling to start doing the kind of work that they're doing. And Hegel is much, I think, even despite himself, since he generally did have a low regard of the British empiricists, there are still these empiricist sensibilities in Hegel in various places, including with this idea of the relation between feeling and concept. Other instances too, where in the introductory framing to his entire Naturphilosophie, he says point blank that metaphysics must remain permanently, and here it would be very provisional, much like Tadde's presentation of metapsychology. Metaphysics has to remain perpetually conditioned by physics, the latter in the broad sense at the time of empirical, experimental, modern natural science in general. I think that there are various ways in which one can see the British empiricists being much more important for the sensibilities of some of these thinkers than we suspect. I mean, with Lacan too, like in the introduction to the Objective Fictions volume I edited with Alenka and Bostian, looking to it, another figure from the British tradition, Jeremy Bentham, and just how much mileage Lacan is able to get from something like Bentham's theory of fictions. Anyhow, those are just a few hopefully not entirely random associations. But yeah, thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, Adrian. Well, please join me.